CPOE Lab, creating and printing a lab order. To create a new lab order, the screen and the data requirements are going to be the same. However, the way you access the screen is what's going to vary. This will be determined by your local workflow as well as the specific scenario, such as whether or not the patient has an appointment, whether they have an encounter, and then whether or not you want to do direct data entry, whether you want to do it indirectly, whether you have an interface, and so on. Now, some related videos that cover some of these in more detail would be your lab orders overview and the eLab interface. But the focus of this video is simply creating and printing an order, and we are going to go through these different scenarios and workflows. First of all, you'll notice here I'm logged in as Connor, the medical assistant, and we're going to look at the scenario where there is no encounter, but there's an appointment. We see down here on our schedule, we do have Chewy Anderson who's scheduled for an appointment. And let's say that Chewy needs to have some pre-op labs done. He's going to come in next week for a consultation and have surgery scheduled, but Dr. Cooper wants to get some labs drawn on him. So while I have selected Chewy's appointment, and notice the appointment is in scheduled status, it does not have to be arrived, I have the L button right here on the schedule to create a lab order. So I'm simply going to click that L, and that's going to open up my lab order screen. Now, when I do it in this fashion, the lab order screen becomes the dominant window. So it does overlay my schedule, meaning I would have to stop what I'm doing at the schedule level, complete my lab order before I could do anything else. Now, I'm going to go back to Chewy Anderson, select the appointment again, and instead of clicking the L button from the appointment, I'm going to click the stethoscope to take me to the encounter screen. And you'll see, based upon the tan colored patient band, Chewy does not have an open encounter. However, here on the left-hand side, even though my encounter level menu choices are grayed out, my lab order option is available. And if I click that lab order option, it opens up the same window we just saw at the schedule level. So whether you're doing it from the schedule screen or from the face sheet encounter, when there is not an active encounter, we're going to click the lab order, which automatically opens in data entry mode. The order number will be assigned by the system once we save it. Order date is going to default to the current date, but we can change it. If we would like to give them a requisition for next week or next month, we can do that. It's defaulting to the patient we've chosen. We can enter a comment if needed, whether it's a comment for the lab if we want it to print on the requisition, if it's internal comments for our eyes only here and within the system, or comments that we would like to print out on the output. Our status defaults as entered because we're in data entry mode. Now, once we complete the order, based on approval rights, if Connor, as a medical assistant, has been given approval rights, that status will automatically change to approved. If he does not have approval rights, the status will remain entered, and it will send an alert to the doctor so that the doctor can then approve it. So that is going to be based upon permissions assigned to your clinical staff. Status will always default to routine. However, you can change it to stat or scheduled based upon, again, your local preferences and workflow. Results by will default to the current date, but you can also change that. If you want to know the results immediately, then of course you would leave it for today's date, or you can set it for a future date. In the case of no encounter, the physician is going to default to the patient's primary care physician under patient register. Now, if there's another doctor in the office that has requested his labs, maybe Dr. Butler, we're going to go ahead and choose Dr. Butler now to be the ordering physician. The next section is the actual vendor header section. We can choose our vendor within the drop-down. Now, if it's an in-house lab, we're going to choose our in-house lab, and that will go through a different workflow. If you're sending the patient outside, then of course you can choose the appropriate vendor, whether it's LabCorp, Quest, and so on. For this particular purpose, since I'm going to print the requisition, I'm going to click Generic Lab instead of one that I have an interface with. Now, the bill type, account number, and sample, these are going to be required based on different scenarios when you're doing a lab interface. When you're doing a paper lab, it's entirely up to you and the lab you're sending it to if you want to choose these values. They're not required, however, unless you have a local requirement for them. Down here at the bottom is where we're going to enter the test that we're ordering. So when I click the plus sign, which of course within Prognosis is our universal search and add option, it initially launches my doctor preferred screen. Now this is matching the doctor on the lab. You'll recall back here I chose Dr. Butler. Well, Dr. Butler has never defined any preferred tests. So he would have to go to the book icon, which is all tests. Now if I go ahead and choose that doctor and put it back to Dr. Cooper, when I click the plus sign, I see his preferred tests. That, of course, is all handled at a local level with regards to physician preferences. So let's say Dr. Cooper just wants to order a CBC, a glucose, and an HDL. So we just click those and we say OK. Now all of those tests will come in once. Over here to the right, we have our opportunity of assigning ICDs. In this case, since we don't have an encounter, we're dealing with Chewy's medical history. If I click the H button, it is going to show me ICD codes that is in this patient's medical history. In the case of Chewy Anderson, I have none. Now, if he had ICD codes in his medical history, we would be able to choose it here to assign it to our laboratory test. We also have the option here of clicking the plus sign. The plus sign opens up the universal diagnosis search. Again, it defaults to the preferred list for the doctor. We can go to all and do a universal diagnosis search. So for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to select that first one, generalized abdominal pain. Now, that is just assigning it to this patient so that I can now associate it to my test because I'm outside the context of an encounter. If I were on an encounter, that would have automatically associated the diagnosis. So now I can click my magnifying glass and select that particular ICD code. Now, ICDs are not a requirement, again, unless, of course, you're dealing with an interface or a vendor that does want that data. So this would also fall upon your local workflow if you need to associate that. We also have an assign ICD, so if you need to do multiples. You notice here it only gave me one diagnosis that I selected. If I click my assign ICDs and I have multiples chosen in here, I can put all of them against that line item. So for instance, if I go back here to my plus sign, and I'm going to go ahead and add a few other diagnoses here, all of those diagnoses now exist on this patient's diagnosis clipboard, and now maybe I want to put all of them for this lab test. So you do have different options there. With regards to my collection data, I can go ahead and enter it individually on these slots if I'm actually drawing the specimen in-house. If not, though, then of course you can leave those blank. The sample specs is going to be applicable at the test level. So normally this is going to be in conjunction with your eLab interface unless you have manually chosen to associate a comment to the test to get the user's attention. But in the case of like Quest Diagnostics, which we will see an example of in our eLab video, sometimes there are specifications for tests where the lab requires you to do something specific. That may or may not be relevant for you. So now that I've completed all of that, I'm simply going to click Save. And when I do, keep your eye up here on the status. Now notice it says approved, and my confirmation says save and approve, successful. So that means that Connor does have approval rights. If he hadn't, this message would have simply said save successful. The status would have remained entered, and then based on the supported event property, the doctor would have received a notification that he needed to approve the lab. Now my collection button is enabled once I've saved it. I mentioned down here at the detail level, you could individually specify date and time when you're doing it in-house, or when, in this case, when there's multiples, you can click the collection button. Now the benefit of the collection button, as in this case, since we have multiple tests, is you can apply date and time to all of them at once or only specific ones, based again upon whether or not you've chosen to do the specimen draw in-house. Now with regards to our date and time, you'll notice we have the little new icon. That means go ahead and indicate that this date and time is right now. So it will choose the current date and time of your computer system. Then you can determine whether you want it to go against only this selected test, like for instance I choose CBC only, because maybe I drew the glucose and HDL at a different time. Or in our example, I'm going to say all, and it goes ahead and selects all of them. And when I click update, it puts that date and time as my collection date and time. Now I also have food, drink, date and time. Maybe I want to indicate the last time they had ingested food or beverage. I'm going to go ahead and put last night at midnight. And I'm going to apply it to all my food and drink and update and then save it. So whichever your preferences are, if you're doing it in-house, you have that functionality. Now, once you've saved the test and got all of the required fields that your vendor needs, you can now complete the requisition. Now, in this video, we're not going to deal with the eLab interface. That is handled separately. But up here on our icon bar, in addition to the eLab icon, we do have our fax and our printer. And you also have a preview option. Now, I'm going to click the preview option initially. Your database can have unlimited number of requisitions. And based upon the vendors that you work with, if they have specific formats that they need, then you can have each of those templates available. As you see here, we have e-requisitions, we have lab order, we have reminders, so on. Now, of course, this is just my training environment. You're going to have LabCorp requests, whatever vendors you work with. Now, the reason I came in here to the preview is you'll notice that my AFP is the first one in my list. If I cancel this, if I click the printer icon directly, that's the requisition is going to print. So unless the generic lab that I've chosen wants that format, then you want to come in here to the preview and choose the appropriate template first. So I'm just going to choose my generic one called lab order. Then I will click my option print and mail and say send. And in this context, send means send it to the printer. Because if I wanted to fax it to my vendor, I would say fax and send. And that would then send it over the fax to the vendor. Some people get confused in the semantics of that button because that is not sending it electronically. It's going to send it either to the printer or the fax. The other way would be to make sure that your generic requisition is your default. And if that is your default, then you do not have to preview it first. You could simply print it. Faxing, once you have fax set up, and that is something that when you go through your implementation process, it should be done. You would simply click the fax button, and then it's done through the background as long as your vendor has a fax number. Now, regardless if the requisition is faxed or printed, notice here that the status has now changed to ordered. And in parentheses, you will see the method of how it was ordered. This is that third status we spoke of in our lab overviews video. It'll start as entered, it turns to approved, and then once the requisition is actually generated, it becomes ordered. And that's regardless of if it is by eLab, by printing, or by faxing. So that was the method of direct data entry for a lab order. There's also an option which would be based upon your local workflow and your doctor's preferences of what we call an indirect option. And this would be where the physician will indicate on his assessment and plan the test that he wants, but then it's up to his medical assistant or his nurse to come in behind him and actually complete that order. This is typically the workflow in larger facilities, especially where there's multiple physicians or very busy, where you're seeing 50, 60 patients a day because of the sheer volume. And also, with the way healthcare insurance works, oftentimes the patient's insurance will determine whether they're going to Quest or LabCorp or some other lab that is local to your area. And the doctor doesn't typically have the time to worry about those clerical decisions, so he puts that upon his staff. So in this scenario, I'm logged in here as Dr. Cooper in conjunction with my assessment and plan. Let's say here in my patient, Diego Campos, he's being treated for generalized abdominal pain and asthma. And maybe for the generalized pain, I just want to order a CBC. So while my diagnosis of generalized abdominal pain is selected, down here in the lower right, I have these gray buttons, and these are called order sheet buttons. I'm going to go ahead and click my lab, which opens up the binocular and defaults me to my preferred list. So I'm going to go ahead and say CBC. And as the physician, that's all I need to do. Now, if I do want to put comments on here for the lab, I can certainly do that, or I'm just going to click OK. Now, the benefit here is twofold for the physician because notice it automatically populates as part of his plan notes. Therefore, he does not have to manually indicate that he's ordering that blood test because it's automatically added in there. Now, if he wanted to order a different test for the asthma, he could, or again, based on diagnosis requirements at the vendor level, he could have ordered them all back there at the abdominal pain issue. Now that I have selected my asthma, maybe for the asthma, I want to do a electrolyte panel. And again, that just automatically comes into my note. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. Now notice my CBC is still present for my generalized abdominal pain. My electrolyte panel is present for my asthma because I assigned them to different diagnoses. So that's all the doctor would have to do in this workflow. So now I'm going to log in as Connor, the medical assistant, who's going to go in behind Dr. Cooper and complete the requisitions. Now, with regards to this order sheet workflow, on the homepage schedule, which you'll recall from our previous videos, has a real-time 60-second refresh. Always tells you what the status is. Now, if we look here for San Diego Campos, the status says Process L. Now, of course, on my homepage here, you'll notice others also say Process L, Process LD, Process DP, and so on. That process status is coming from the order sheet. L means lab. Now, you'll notice the color coding is different because I have a Process L in yellow. I have a Process L in green. The difference there is, notice when you hover over, the entire status is available. With doctor is color-coded as green. Arrived is color-coded as yellow. So the color is going to be determined by the primary status, whether they're with doctor, ready for checkout, and so on. So based on your workflow, if you've changed the status to ready for checkout, as we see here in the case of Daniel Hernandez, if he had had labs ordered, it would be the bright pink, but instead of checkout, it would say Process L. The screen real estate is limited, so we can only show the most current status, but the color and the tooltip retains the entire status. So as a means of communication internally, you'll know to go in there immediately and process the L. So to do that, Connor's going to choose the order sheet. In this case, when we go to our lab tab, you'll notice that there are two here to be ordered, CBC and electrolyte panel. They've got the applicable diagnoses. So all the medical assistant needs to do, or the person doing the checkout, whoever's given the responsibility of the order sheet, is click the order button. That's going to prompt them to choose the vendor. So at that point, they will know whether or not this patient needs to go to in-house lab, LabCorp, Quest, and so on. We'll just go ahead and choose LabCorp for this example, and we'll click OK. That's going to bring up the requisition so that it can be printed. And now the order sheet refreshes. The status is now going to say ordered instead of to be ordered. We see that here in orange. And then just visually for you, if we go back to our home page, we see now it has gone to blue with MA because Connor, am a medical assistant. So it's no longer green, which indicated with doctor. It's now blue. And it says with MA because the Process L is done. I have processed it. So if you want to use the order sheet workflow to let the doctor indirectly order the labs through his assessment and plan, and then somebody else do the follow-up and actually print the paperwork, that is a possibility. So in review, with regards to creating a lab order, there are two options using the same screen and data requirements. These options are driven by your patient scenarios as well as your workflow preferences within the practice. Patient scenarios would include, does the patient have an appointment? Do they have an open encounter? Or are you going to do it through their face sheet encounter only? Workflow preferences include direct data entry into the lab order screen, indirectly, where the physician would select the tests and needed through the assessment and plan, and his clinician would follow up by completing the requisition using the order sheet, and of course the eLab option, which was not discussed in this video. With regards to the hard copy requisitions, these come standard with your database, or you can customize them through local preferences or through vendor-specific needs. And once the requisition is in the system, it can be printed or faxed to the vendor. That concludes this video within the series. Please click the appropriate link below for your next step. If you'd like to take a quiz, you will receive your results in real time directly on the screen so that you can see how well you've done. If you answer incorrectly, the system will prompt you with the correct response. In addition, a confidential email will be sent to the education team to help us better serve you with our educational offerings. Second, advance to the next video within the series you're currently in. And finally, return to the video library main page. As always, feel free to contact us through the Resource Center or email with any additional questions or comments.